All righty. Thanks everyone for joining us. Today we are going to talk about transforming sales training and specifically hear from a wonderful Novartis stakeholder about how they leverage simulation technology for onboarding success. So very excited you all are joining us. This is going to be fun and we're going to learn a lot. Our speaker today is Keenan Stare, Product and Disease Training Manager for Radioligand Therapy at Novartis. And Keenan's impressive. He joined the Skills and Capabilities Training team at Novartis in April 2023. Prior to that, he's promoted a variety of ophthalmic medications across a diverse portfolio ranging from ocular surface disease, glaucoma, and postoperative drops. He was introduced to training early in his career, serving as a regional field training manager, and today he enjoys collaborating with a multitude of partners to reimagine how learning is delivered, just like the innovative therapies he promotes. And he's a real and very cool human outside of being a training professional. He and his wife love introducing their son to new experiences, staying active by golfing and hiking, and taking on culinary challenges together. Keenan, welcome. We're delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you, Russ. Appreciate the warm introduction. You and Becky have been really gracious hosts. Looking forward to sharing some of the experiences that we went through with Quantified and the team with the guests today.
Outstanding. Well, let's dive right in then. The first thing I'd like to point out is that as we talk about AI in life sciences training, we're way past the early adopters. Typically, when you look at adoption of technology, it goes through a curve from the innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and of course, everybody's favorite segment, the laggards. And this is a survey that we ran, I believe, back in March, but still very, very relevant. Because even then, over half of respondents believe that life sciences training is beyond the early adopter stage in terms of AI. So that's just a really impressive statistic. I just highlight it just if you're on the webinar and you're not currently involving AI products in your training, you may be missing what a lot of people are doing, and there may be an opportunity for you to learn more, jump on board, and still get ahead of the late majority and the laggards that are not yet there. And the reason this matters, the challenge for sales training really across industries, life sciences certainly, but other industries as well, there's some sort of brutal statistics here that I want to take just a moment to level set on. Average time to quota capable, meaning the point at which a salesperson starts actually paying their rent, so to speak, by hitting quota, is almost a year, 11.2 months. We all know the difference between the stars and the slugs on the sales team, but it's worth noting that high performing reps outperform average reps by over 2x. And yet, according to Salesforce, right now, 84% of reps that responded to the Salesforce State of Sales report reported that they were missing their quotas. And we know the solution is evaluating how people are doing and giving them the coaching and training they need. And yet, fewer than half of managers spend more than 30 minutes per week on coaching. So fundamentally, there's this deficit of the training and coaching people need and the bandwidth of managers and trainers to actually deliver that training. So Keenan, I'd love for you to, share with me what your objective was when we first began working with you, talking with you about Quantified. What were you trying to accomplish?
Yeah, happy to dive in just 1 second, but I want to review that last slide one more time and just kind of what you were describing as we get into training. I think we're all under the guise that we have all of this time really spent coaching and developing people. And that was certainly a misunderstanding that I had early in my training career. So it's tools like Quantified that help free us up from our day jobs, if you will, and really spend time on what we know and love, and being with people and helping them to achieve their goals as well. So happy to jump into the objectives now, Russ.
But I love that because that is, we think of young, idealistic Keenan walking in saying, I'm going to train people, coach people, and make their life better. And then, like all of us with any kind of job, we end up with sort of this brutal reality of, oh, that's not really what I spend most of my day doing.
Yeah, the day to day, it can get a bit mundane in some ways, but you live for that, 5 to 10% of the time where you're with folks and really making a deep impact. I would be remiss though if I didn't start off with a huge thank you to the Quantified team. I know I have two of my favorite people on the line now. Russ, Becky, you guys are working your way into that, but Hallie, Paige, I know you guys are out there listening. Just wouldn't have been able to come through this experience without you. Um, for anybody that has not had the opportunity to work with Quantified yet, I can say that their customer experience has been unmatched. They have tailored so many solutions for us based off the individual needs that we had. I also want to, shout out that I have a partner who you may hear a little bit about throughout this training. Her name is Mary. If you hear me refer to her, that's exactly who I'm talking about. And she was equally involved in the rollout of this tool for our team. Of course, we had support from our training director and certainly our partners in operations and curriculum development, which helped bring this whole solution to fruition. So important that you understand that there's not just one person, myself, behind the delivery of such an incredible solution that we needed. So with all of that out of the way, Russ, I think I'll finally go ahead and dive in to your point about the objective.
Well, I'm going to say before you do that we're all blushing at what you
Sure.
said because it's wonderful, but I do take the point no one succeeds alone. It's always a team effort. So I love that.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it was all hands on deck. You'll hear just in a second why, and I think that's the right place to start is kind of detailing that situation, right? So for our radioligand therapy team, we had anticipated a significant expansion that would be occurring sometime in 2024, but certainly not anticipated for the early portion of the year. However, those expectations were quickly changed and we began conducting an expedited hiring process really to kick off 2024. There's some specific dates that I can involve, but I don't think it's really an important point here. What I do want to highlight, though, is that our team was expected to move from about 60 sales specialists in total, along with 8 field leaders, to right around 150 sales specialists, 18 field leaders, and then 3 regional leaders. So certainly an over 100% increase in terms of the headcount. And one of the interesting things is that it required some different learning tracks for the specialists and the leaders. So outside of the certification challenges that we're going to face, there were certainly some other challenges that we needed to iron out, but not having to spend as much time and bandwidth on the certification exercise and solution, it freed us up to allocate some of our time elsewhere. Now, on top of this expansion in headcount, we also had to work on a consolidated training timeline where we ordinarily operated on a 5 week schedule that was consolidated down to 2 weeks and 2 days to meet a very aggressive goal of the first day in the field that was set out by our executive leadership team. And so that time is really dedicated to what we call our phase 1 home study. And throughout this training, right, it's really focused on knowledge acquisition. We have things like e-modules, virtual presentation, some reflection and application exercises. But additionally, it has the kind of 2 culmination activities. One being a PI certification, and the second being a verbal assessment, which is really where Quantified came in. And what it allows us to do is reinforce really important information, begin the early application for the next phase of training, and assess any common deficits that we could observe across learners, right? Additionally, I'll say there was one last challenge, and that was that we were unable to pull our current leadership or specialists that were in the field from their day jobs to assist with the verbal assessment process. So it really left Mary and myself and some fearless leaders who would have been able to kind of throw their hat in the ring to assist. But given the short timeline, the high visibilities, and really the lack of human resources available, we knew that we were going to have to approach our certification process differently than we had before, especially considering there was only one day of downtime between phase 1, that home study that I described, and our phase 2 training, which was going to be live in New Jersey. And so this provided only a small window to retest some of those individuals in the event that they didn't meet expectations during the first attempt of their verbal assessment. Russ, does that give you a pretty good picture about some of the challenges that we were dealing with?
That does. And those are daunting challenges, Keenan. in the sense that you had not only an increase in headcount, but an increase in complexity. And apologize for the slides there. I hit the wrong button bluntly. But I was aware of the increase in the size of the force you'd be training, but until right now, I didn't really understand the additional learning tracks, et cetera. So basically a very daunting challenge. And I'm guessing you didn't feel like you were resourced with, oh, and here's a ton of extra people to do this with.
Certainly. And we understood that, right? Because of certainly the pressing needs and the priority of our field team at that time. However, enter quantified. And if you go to the next slide, um, I had previously been introduced to Quantified through a large scale solution that they provided for Novartis when I was a field specialist. And I really remember just being blown away by the technology that they offered and everything that I learned about myself following the program's assessment of short video clips that we all personally submitted. I mean, it was almost more than you wanted to know about yourself. I don't know if that's fair to say, but what I didn't know at that time is that they had offered this AI avatar program that would provide an on-demand and stress-free practice environment that could be adaptable to a variety of learning needs. And I learned about several of our colleagues using this avatar program across our organization for certification purposes. And so we immediately got into contact with the Quantified team to gauge the viability of that same solution for our current situation. And that's when we were introduced to Hallie and Paige, who again I'll just call them our quantified saviors. The two of them worked side by side with myself and Mary to introduce us to the program. And the two lovely ladies that you see on your screen now, they are not to be mistaken with Hallie and Paige. They are very much real human beings. Here you see Victoria and Rosie, two of the avatars that are part of the AI avatar program. And so coming from specialist roles ourselves, Mary and I immediately saw the value in a tool that enabled us to practice when we wanted, really as often as we wanted, to help eliminate that unnecessary stress from assessments. Fortunately, our learners, they felt very similar, and we continue to get very positive feedback to this day. Just like us, once they tried that program for the first time, experiencing really the ease of use and how intuitive the program was, they were hooked. And that's not to say it wasn't met with skepticism, but that skepticism was quickly overcome. And so, as a trainer and a learning professional, Paige and Hallie help to ease our anxiety with new tools as well. Right? We work closely with them to create rubrics for each of the products our learners would be assessed on, and essentially taught the AI how to translate acronyms and other jargon for accurate scoring purposes. They helped us customize the training and the scoring, the reporting, and the feedback that would be reported to learners, which is really one of my favorite parts about this AI avatar tool. It really allows you to challenge your learners as you see fit, in addition to picking which avatar might be right for your audience. And so, to give just a small example and some insight to what I mean by that, right? The feedback could include varying levels of information and or direction on where to find specific information that would allow learners to improve their response, right? You could, for example, provide word for word exactly what you wanted them to capture in their responses, or you could totally blank that out. You could also provide direction about where they may be able to find those in some of their learning and training resources as well. And so, again, that customized nature of the tool was something that really appealed to us, and allowed us to make sure that our learners were going to know exactly what was expected of them and also provide the appropriate direction in the event they were coming up a little bit short. But their partnership, it just made the entire journey seamless. They were quick to join webinars with the learners themselves. They adapted their content to unforeseen challenges, as we went on, to start with our leadership team and later began certifying and introducing this tool to our specialist team. They sent updated reports regularly on both practice and certification, and they were always available to troubleshoot anytime our learners ran into challenges. I truly couldn't be any more complimentary of the incredible customer service that this mighty team of two provided. Um, and thinking back to the situation I was describing previously, I think it's probably becoming pretty clear to the audience now why Quantified's avatar tool was as appealing as an option as it was for Mary and I.
That makes sense. And you mentioned, Keenan, that it was easy for the learners to adopt. And it sounds like, anybody has skepticism when introduced to a new tool, but it sounds like when they logged in and began using it, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like they did learners find it easy to adopt, I guess is really my question.
Absolutely, and that starts with the introduction that both Hallie and Paige were a part of. They developed an easy to present deck where we partnered with them. They spoke to the specific technology. We described how it would be used and how it was going to be valuable for all the learners. But beyond that, it was really simple because they provided support in some how-to videos, and we were able to upload that directly into our learning management systems for reference for the learners as well. So, yeah, absolutely. I would say there may have been some skepticism, especially around the word AI when they heard it for the first time. But ultimately, they quickly realized how easy this tool was and how valuable it was going to be to them.
That's good to hear. And I want to up level just a moment to sort of the challenges that you were faced with, the typical, challenges anybody faces with onboarding. Managers and trainers have a lot on their plate. It's hard to get trainees to really engage, and yet they need to hit the ground running. And one of the things that I worry about most, frankly, Keenan, is the retention of information, because you're probably familiar with the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve and how easy it is to train people on something and then a month later have them remember virtually nothing of it. So I'd love to know, as you look at these challenges, how you address them in rolling this program out. And then after that, I'd love to dive into some of the real specific data, but just curious to know, as you look at these challenges, were there any that really resonated and that you really focused on, hey, we need to overcome this key one?
Yeah, and let me start with your comment about our ability to forget. Right, we always preach to learners that this is the value in this exercise. Right, it's not necessarily in the score that comes out of the assessment, but rather the practice that goes into it. And when we review some of the data in a bit, Russ, I know you understand how impressive it is, but I think it'll become apparent to some of the folks on the line how willing and how excited learners were to use this. And to me, that's one of the most important things that we could possibly do, because if they feel encouraged to leverage a tool like this, they're going to practice more. And we know that that's going to lead to a higher retention of information, right? So, look, many of you on the line are probably learning professionals in some capacity. And most of us know that onboarding, whether you're in the shoes of a trainer or, somebody that's being onboarded themselves, it can feel stressful enough, for training departments. But add in the time constraints that I described and take away some of the human resources that you're usually able to tap into and mix that all with the day job that you have. And now you have yourself a good old fashioned pressure cooker, right? We knew going back to the start that really our biggest bottleneck, it was going to be time. The time to certify was certainly one challenge. We would ordinarily allocate about 30 minutes to execute a single verbal assessment. But the time for learners to practice and develop confidence with the information before entering the next phase of training was an even larger concern for Mary and I. Ordinarily, each of the new hires that we would bring on board would be paired one to one with some sort of mentor, whether it be a team member, or a regional field training specialist. And they would have pretty strict orders to follow that would allow them to methodically prepare for these verbal assessments throughout their 5 weeks of phase one training. However, remember, we're talking about consolidated timelines, so less time to actually prepare and develop confidence with the information and even just learn the information. But additionally, we weren't able to tap into those resources as regularly as what we would have liked to. So envision for maybe a moment, I don't know, maybe you were like me and you watch cartoons before school, but you know how there's, a tiny snowball that just begins to roll down a hill. And by the time it's picked up a little bit of speed, it's also kind of 10x in size. That felt
And
like
then
the
it
potential.
overruns the coyote, right? Because that's what we're
Yeah,
talking about. We're
exactly,
talking
and
about
we were the
predictive.
coyote in this situation, Russ. That felt like the, kind of potential problem that we were moving toward. I mean, when you consider the large number of learners who, without a solution like quantified offer, were also at risk of just very little practice time, if they left phase one training just a little bit behind the eight ball, who knows how far they may have been when it came to the phase two training and then leaving there, going out face to face with customers. And that's probably the last thing that any training department would want to tell their sales leaders is that we don't think that these folks were as well prepared as what we would have liked them to be, right? I certainly wouldn't feel comfortable doing that, regardless of some of the time constraints and challenges that we faced. So,
Yeah,
as you'll see in just a moment, we were fortunately able to avoid that avalanche scenario, thanks to the support our learners receive from Quantified and this specific tool.
that's awesome. Well, let's jump into that and let's look at sort of how, what you found in terms of engagement and, how much people practice, because you've hit on one of my sore points here, Keenan. One of the things I get on a soapbox a lot about is learning doesn't matter unless you practice it. So let's, sort of look at what responses you found.
Absolutely. Thank you. So what you're seeing here, gang, is really what I would just say are the engagement results from that practice simulator. And this is specifically from Mary's class. She was responsible for bringing these folks through the Pluvicto training. You'll see another data set in just a moment that is specific to Ludothera, and that was what I was responsible for. But when you really boil it down, what's most impressive to me is those bottom two bullets. You see that the average score across all questions was a 4.58 out of 5. And this is especially impressive considering the volume of practice that was recorded. And we'll get to that in just a moment as well. You also see that the average improvement in scoring was a 59% improvement from the learner's baseline score. So again, here are some real statistics with a relatively robust data set that shows some very quantitative analysis of how learners could benefit from this solution. And each individual enrolled in the Pluvicto training took advantage of this platform, and probably pretty unsurprisingly, based on what we've already discussed, each of them, all 39, achieved a high score on all questions during their preparation for the verbal assessment. And that's what's represented on that far right bar that you see on the graph on your screen there.
Nice. So fundamentally, high engagement, but also measurable results in terms of, yes, people are improving and getting better, and we're hitting the quality bar we'd like to hit for certification. Because these, I'll highlight, this is certification on a medication. This is not something trivial. People have to get the answers right on these things, and I love seeing that level of response. And then I also noticed that people bluntly, and this doesn't really surprise me, Keenan, because I see it with other customers as well, but it's always gratifying. People practice a lot more than they might practice face to face. And so I'm curious as to your insights as you look at this in terms of, is this good, right? We got 16 practices per person.
I would say it's phenomenal from my experience, right? I don't think that we could have anticipated this from the start. And I certainly don't think that we would have anticipated this number of practice, this total volume of practices that would have happened in the previous scenario that I laid out, right? Whether they be one-to-one with a mentor or regional field training specialist. I don't think that there's, number one, the time in the day for some of our training liaisons to commit to this kind of learning. And B, I don't know that the comfort exists either. But all in all, this is really just what blew us away about this solution for learners. I mean, look at those numbers: 647 total practices by a group of only 39 individuals. And as you mentioned, Russ, on average, over 16 practices per specialist. So while 18 specialists, practice from, anywhere between 1 and 10 times, the next 19 practiced anywhere from 11 to 50 times. I mean, that's incredible. And of course, like every class, you have some of those neurotic outliers. Ours was no different here with, two specialists that I think may have broken the quantified scale. I think that this may have been the first time that you guys had to include that 61 to 70 bucket. But that is some serious commitment. I mean, you have to commend those individuals for their preparation. But if I were,
Absolute.
go ahead,
Go
I'm
ahead. I'm
sorry.
sorry. I was just going to ask how this would compare when you think about the number of practices that might be done sort of old school if you did this manually. I'm betting they wouldn't practice 16.6 times per specialist, but I would bet the dedicated ones would still practice a lot. So how big a difference is this really, Keenan?
So what we would ordinarily build in is essentially one dedicated practice time per week with those mentors. So you would expect 5 different touch points in which they would probably practice each of those questions, anywhere between 1 to 2 times, right? So let's say at a high end, we're saying 10 practices. And I would say that those are those individuals that are highly dedicated, really well prepared, unwilling to fail. And of course, you may build in the expectation that some of them are practicing at home as well, and delivering those to the mirror, potentially to their spouse, their children, or maybe even their pets, anybody that would listen, right? But I don't think that we would have achieved quite the volume that we saw with the AI avatar. I think that that is probably the most striking thing that I noticed, and certainly consistency that we observed across the board with Lutathera as well.
That's good to hear. And let's look at, obviously we practice for a reason, not just for fun. And so let's look at sort of certification because that was the objective, right? We wanted them to practice such that they could pass the certification exam competently.
Absolutely. And so on the day of certification, you'll see that all 39 specialists certified with a score of 4 or 5, and certainly a majority of them, around 75%, as represented by the blue portion of the pie on the bottom graph, right, with a 5. Furthermore, 95% of them did so on their very first attempt. And that all credit goes to the learners, right? Because they invested the time and the energy, as we saw just the slide prior, to ensure that they were well prepared when it came to this day. I'll also point out that the average certification time took just about 3 minutes. And you'll notice that there's going to be a difference as we examine the next data set. To me, I believe that this is a result of how the questions are designed and speaks again to the customizable nature that you can create for your learners based off the content that they may need to understand and articulate for your specific solution, right? I think, too, one other thing that we noted just on the day of certification, just as a little bit of a watch out, some of the learners were challenged from a technological standpoint. The fortunate thing is that it didn't result in any kind of challenges in terms of altering their scores. But I think that if you asked Hallie and Paige, who were intimately involved in this exercise as well, they would say that was where the overwhelming majority of questions came from. The learners, based off of the practice and certainly the simulator that they used in advance, were very well prepared and very comfortable in that environment. It was just a matter of ensuring that they recorded their responses accurately. So that was a learning that we applied to the second group that had gone through this, was really just walking them through a step-by-step basis of how they were going to need to record those responses on the day of certification.
That makes sense because certainly, technology can help, but it all comes down to, as you know well, effective program design, effective certification design. And you've mentioned the next data set, Lutathera. So unless you object, let's jump right into that.
No, absolutely. I think we'll see some consistent trends here, fortunately. And this is, like I said, what I was responsible for. And so, I'm a man of integrity because here you can see that 33 of the 35 of the learners in my training class achieved a high score on all those questions. Not quite 100% like Mary's. Otherwise, I may have told you that this was my class's data set was actually the first one. So, not to beat a dead horse here, but really, you can see the strong performance across the board in the average score and the improvement that specialists experienced. And to me, this just helped to validate what we saw in the first data set. And it wasn't just an anomaly, and it provided inspiration for how we could continue to use this tool into the future, and for some potentially new applications that we'll discuss in a bit.
Nice. Well, I like, something that I really like here that you've just hit on is the iterative nature of any program. Lutathera was first. You didn't get quite as much engagement, although very high engagement, quite as many high scores. And then you were able to take that learning and for the next product you used it with Mary's, you were able to, increase those numbers. So that's awesome because you always want to be setting the bar and then raising the bar.
Absolutely. And like I said, we're fortunate to partner with Hallie and Paige, who helped us anticipate what some of those challenges would be in the first place. But the moment that some of those challenges came up from the first set of learners, we were able to go back and adapt some of the content that they had delivered. That way, we were just proactively addressing some of the needs that we anticipated the learners having.
Nice, nice. I'm going to jump to the next one then and look at practice volume, which also, frankly, for Lutathera seems to me relatively impressive. And again, I'm very curious as to, especially since this is, your area, curious to know how you think this would compare to what people would practice in an old school manner without a simulator.
Yeah, like I previously mentioned, Russ, I think that if I were in your shoes, I would probably lead with this in the Pluvicto practice volume slide every single time. Because let's face it, nobody, whether you're training for a pharmaceutical sales job or you're undergoing any kind of assessment, number one, we don't always love to practice, but number two, we especially don't like to feel the stress and anxiety that can be associated with an assessment, right? And so this to me just speaks volume to the comfort that individuals felt with this learning solution. And it really allowed them to, what I always say is get the marbles out of their mouth so that as we transitioned into that next phase of learning, they were able to do so more seamlessly. It wasn't the first time that they were getting the words out of their mouth and the information for the first time, but actually many of them have become experts at doing so, right? And so again, when you look at the total practice volume, we see an average number of nearly 10 practices per specialist, which again is just really certainly on the high end of what we would expect for formal practice sessions in the more traditional format that we had. Additionally, we saw an uptick in the average time spent practicing here compared to the Pluvicto data set. And I believe that this really can be attributed to some of the questions and prompts requiring some longer answers and maybe some more information based on the product's individual assessment questions. And so, regardless, the engagement with the platform continued to be remarkable and helped to lead to some incredible results the second time around as well.
Outstanding. And let's take just a look at those results in terms of certification.
Yeah, so again, happy for my team that I brought through this learning experience as well to have similar results to what we saw with Pluvicto. Again, with 100% of those learners certifying on their very first attempt, with an overwhelming majority scoring a 5 based on the graph on that bottom right-hand side of the page, just like with Pluvicto. Additionally, we saw the average certification time is nearly double that of what Pluvicto is. Again, just to reiterate, I think this is based on the variety in the verbal assessment prompts and some of the information that was required to answer those questions in full. Overall, again, we've just seen incredible traction and success with this solution and product, not just on paper, but anecdotally as well. What was noted, like I said, is early skepticism with the tool quickly turned into excitement throughout the early phases of training. And the huge practice numbers that we observed helped those specialists jumpstart the next phase of their training, already committing some of this critical information to memory and being able to get it out of their mouth in a very articulate fashion. So, all in all, just super impressive results, better than we could have expected at the beginning of this.
Nice. And the get the marbles out of your mouth that you said earlier, I'm just going to remember that because that's a wonderful expression for getting fluent with any given pitch where you need to go from I've learned it to I'm actually, sort of skilled and comfortable delivering it. And it seems like they were able to achieve that by the time they certified.
I would agree, Russ. And one additional point on that is since they had mastered the information, so many of them had by that point, it allowed them to bring kind of their own authentic approach as we transition to that next phase of learning, right? To actually not just recite some of the data set, for instance, and some of the clinical studies, the trial design, the outcome, the safety results, but also allowed them to inject some of that storytelling that we know is so powerful in sales. And so again, it just allowed them to really hit the ground running and expedite, their readiness to be in front of customers and be effective in front of customers, most importantly.
If you don't mind my using a really big word for that, the word I always love for that is synthesis, meaning you've gone from taking the information in to being able to combine that information with other stuff, recontextualize it, make it your own, and as you said, make it persuasive through telling a story that clearly is not scripted. So that's really good to hear, because to me, that's when learning really happens, is when synthesis happens.
Absolutely. Yeah. You took away the need to recall that information and really think about it because it had become so reactive by the time that they had finished practicing with this AI simulator.
Very cool. Well, what I'm curious about is what's next. We've done some cool stuff with Pluvicto and Lutathera, but from your perspective, as you look at the expanding remit of your team, being challenged to do more with less, as we all are, all of those things, what's next for you? What's next for Novartis?
Yeah, so I can speak specifically for our radioligand therapy team, and we're going to continue to look for opportunities to integrate this solution into our new hire training for certain. I'll briefly touch on two specific use cases that we're excited to implement in the near future. The first is really expanding on the idea of the current verbal assessments. I believe there's an opportunity to add breadth to the subjects that we focus on and potentially implement a second assessment that would occur earlier in that 5 week training schedule. Really, I would anticipate learners completing two sets of assessments using the same tool, not only for practice, but for the completion of those assessments as well at weeks 3 and 5, respectively. This would enable our teams to focus on valuable information outside of the product's label alone, which would really help reinforce their knowledge of the disease state, the patient journey, and some of the competitive landscape. And to me, that's so valuable because, especially when we talk about the patients and what they experience, that is one of the, it is really the only common thing that we share in terms of priorities with the HCPs that we engage with. And so it's so important to make sure that we commit some of that information to detail oh goodness, and to empathize with the patients and what they are going through. I have a feeling that, like many of you online, we in the RLT space with Novartis, we over-index on some of the product-specific training. And while it's so important to be an expert, and to be a trusted resource for your customers, I think sometimes it can come at the cost of potentially forgetting about some of that information that may be more specific to the disease and the patient journey. And so that's something that I'd really like to do, is implement a second assessment. And I know that'll be much to the chagrin of some of our learners. However, like I was just describing before, the value is not necessarily in the assessment itself. The value is in the practice that they are going to gain in order to be prepared for that assessment. And so that's really one of the use cases we see.
That makes great sense in terms of evaluating a little more holistically, because you're right. We often do look at, is your product knowledge, on target and right? And there's a lot more to that, to any sales conversation or any conversation with an HCP.
Yeah. And to dive into the second solution, right? I think that we see an opportunity to use this program to bridge the gap between product and disease knowledge and some of the selling skills that our learners are learning about and integrating for their own, right? And so at Novartis, we have a really heightened focus on selling skills and capabilities that regardless of what disease state or products you might be promoting, that you're going to get trained on. And we have an incredible team that develops those skills with our learners. But with that said, sometimes we've heard feedback that describes the challenge of melding those two focuses together, right? Both product and disease, and then those selling skills. And so I believe that programming this avatar tool to prompt learners like an HCP would can enable an integration of really putting those selling skills to practice by using information specific to our learners' business unit or therapeutic area, as we like to say at Novartis. So, for example, we may develop prompts and scripts to help them engage with an HCP that might help develop the unmet need in patients with prostate cancer or with gastroenteropancreatic cancer, right? In addition, to the scoring that Quantified's program offers, it also offers a skills section, an evaluation, which provides feedback on the user's delivery and can be tremendously helpful to develop confidence and authenticity before they would begin interacting with customers. And so again, it's not that we're necessarily using the tool to learn information, but rather apply information. And I think that this is the great time where we would meld those two things together, both product and disease and skill, and perform, or rather, it provides that environment that is comfortable to kind of feel comfortable failing do that, or just maybe a little bit uncomfortable doing it for the very first time, right?
Makes great sense. And I love, because again, that gets to the idea of there's saying the right thing and there's saying it in the most persuasive, effective way. And you're starting to work on addressing both those problems, which is really exciting for us and for our team to partner with you on. So that's fantastic next steps from my perspective.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to it. Again, I think that there's probably a number of use cases that we haven't even thought of by now that you and your team would be happy to discuss. But I think that those are two low-hanging fruit that really do meet the needs of the learners based off of feedback that we've previously received.
Makes great sense. And I know the team's excited to go there with you. As we look sort of, a lot of what you've mentioned, people practice more, people increase their capabilities. We see this across industries, certainly in life sciences, certainly with Novartis, and we've seen very detailed data on that today. But we really do see that across industries with reps practicing 6 times as much and getting a good deal more coaching as well, and slashing their time to quota capable. So that's sort of what we see across industries. What I'd love to do now, if you're okay with it, Keenan, we've got just a question or two from the audience that I'd love to dive into if you'd be amenable to that.
Oh, of course.
Cool. So this is a really simple one. How do you adapt your training programs to different learner needs?
Yeah, well, I think you saw how we described how we adapted to the business needs, but I like your question a little bit better because this is really what matters at the end of the day. And what I'll say to that is, I think that we're in the earliest stages, and I speak for myself. I know some of our colleagues have dove more deeply into the subject, but in the radioligand therapy training team, we're in the very early stages of adapting our training to the specific needs of learners, right? And I think it's important to really consider what those needs are up front before necessarily just saying, "Hey, we have a solution that's going to fit for them." I know that there's been programs that some of our colleagues have used that would enable some of our learners to quote unquote test out of specific modules or virtual webinars, if you will. And I think that that's a really great opportunity because it's going to only heighten the engagement when you treat learners like adults, right? Like they are. They're going to see that there's some give and take with that, and likely be more engaged when it comes to the actual more mandatory learning that they're going to go through. But one of the things that we like to do today is really enlist the assistance from some of our medical colleagues. We're fortunate enough to work with radio pharmaceutical pharmacists and radiologists. We have trained radiation oncologists and medical oncologists on our internal team. And so, one of the great things that we do with them is we set some time aside in advance of these webinars where we collaborate and we share with them a little bit about the background of the individuals who are joining us. Because in RLT, not only do they have to learn about the disease state, not only do they have to learn about the products themselves, but they have to tackle nuclear medicine and this kind of different patient pathway. And so it's really important that that third subject kind of pulls everything together because there's an extra learning component, I think, compared to most trainings that I've worked through, either as a specialist or on the training side, that's important to tackle. So that's one of the small things that we're doing today to help adapt to the learner needs, is really think about their experience specifically with nuclear medicine and think about how much or how little detail is required to ensure that they are perfectly clear on how this information is going to show up in their day to day and how they're going to apply it in the real world.
I love that. And that fits to something I strongly believe, which is you have to meet learners where they are. And so understanding what they know and how fluent they are with the information prior to training them becomes really important.
Absolutely. We totally agree on that facet. And one of the things that we've seen an appetite for as well is more interactivity. And whether that be, we understand that there is an essential need for what I would just call knowledge acquisition, whether that be through e-module or virtual presentations, right? But finding some ways to apply that information in between those different things, or even just the opportunity to reflect can be so valuable for learners to really let this information kind of seep in and understand how they're going to process it for their own.
Very cool. And we've got time for one final question. And this one I think is a really interesting one. You mentioned, some real improvement in time to certification and, a throughput, basically, ability to get learners through the program, through the certification queue. What were the negative trade-offs you dealt with there? Was there anything where you said, on the one hand, we're able to move faster, and on the other hand, here is something we might be losing? And I'd encourage you to just be super honest about that because
Yeah,
everything is a trade-off, right?
for sure. And I appreciate, your courage to ask the question considering your position here as well. I would say if you want to call it a negative, I don't know that I would. I think that there was an initial learning curve for us to adapt the solution to our specific needs. And so there's an investment in time and energy and bandwidth for sure. And again, I mentioned how busy I understand a lot of people in our shoes are. So if you want to look at that as a negative, you might. But what I think is once we did it one time, we could basically lift those exact same settings and just shift them over to a different date and time. And so having done that hard work up front is going to enable us to have this solution, I believe, for a very long time, which is really, really great. I think that's one piece. The other part I touched on briefly was just a bit of the technological hurdle for some of our learners. And we did see in some of the practices that there was, some disagreements in terms of some of the scores that had been, I guess, earned. I'll say. Unfortunately, it was just because they weren't necessarily sure how to utilize that program the first time around. But shortly after, they took some time to familiarize. They were able to get those more authentic scores that they genuinely did earn by the end of that program. And so I think just a little bit of time and grace for the learners to make sure that there was some space between the first opportunity to practice and also the time that they would be assessed. I think it was really important to consider that and how we were going to provide that for them so that there was comfort, not only with the information, but with the technology and the platform itself. Outside of that, it was really just responding to one-off inquiries about troubleshooting. But like I said, the great thing that we had, the privilege to experience was the partnership from the Quantified team. And, they were adamant about being included on all of those communications. Fortunately, our teams had already seen those individuals and heard from them from face to face. And so anytime that there was a challenge that came up, not only did Paige get copied on those requests, but if she didn't respond like in under 5 minutes, which she ordinarily did, she also offered to share her cell phone with me so I could reach out and make sure that the needs of our learners were met. So again, I really have a hard time seeing what some of the trade-offs were here, other than the investment of time and taking that time to get familiar with a new tool.
Well, and for what it's worth, Keenan, you've hit on something there that's pretty important to me. I've been marketing software for many, many years, and software is not magic. It's like most things, you'll get out of it what you put into it. And, your team, you and Mary, were phenomenal in being willing to invest the time to get the good result out of it. In essence, slowing down to speed up, getting it right, and then you can scale.
Exactly, exactly, and it certainly enabled us to do that into the future, and like I said, now I feel like we have this great framework to adapt to some of those other learning solutions that I touched on before.
Outstanding. Well, Keenan, we are very much at time, but I have very much enjoyed the conversation with you. And I think it's been a great conversation for everybody on the webinar as well. And I'll leave the audience with this. If you don't know much about Quantified, feel free to check us out at quantified.ai and evaluate what we've done. We'd love to talk to you and help you if you can. And Keenan, I'd just like to thank you very much for the partnership, for being such a powerful advocate, and for being willing to speak with us on our behalf and work to help make learners' lives better by doing this. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time. Thank you for putting this together, and thank you to everybody for joining. I hope that it was valuable to those of you that took the time out of the day.
I know it was largely because of your contribution.